Amanda's voice cut through the Christmas morning like a blade. "You're such a useless old woman." The words landed in my chest and stayed there, cold and sharp. I remember looking at her and hearing only the scrape of a chair, the faint ticking of an old clock, the smell of cinnamon from my apple crisp filling the room like something out of another life. Minutes later, I would be dialing 911, but that came after the rest of the afternoon unraveled. My name is Margaret Foster. Everyone calls me Maggie. I am 67 years old. I brought the apple crisp. I've been bringing it to Brian's house every Christmas for as long as Jake and Emma can remember. That little dish of tart apples, brown sugar, butter, and oats, topped with a sprig of rosemary this year, was more than dessert. It was a small ritual. It was my way of being there, quietly in the edges of their lives. If this is reaching you and you like these kinds of true life stories, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I'll be here. I need you to be here with me for what comes next. The house smelled like pine and coffee. Fairy lights blinked on a mantle crowded with photos. Brian in his 20s with a wild mop of hair. Jake at 8 holding a soccer ball. Emma at 5 in a ridiculous Halloween costume. The TV murmured a game in the background. Paper crinkled. For a few minutes, it was the perfect, ordinary holiday. Laughter, small, guarded. Brian and I exchanged the kind of little looks that said we both knew the grandchildren were holding back the kinds of surprises only teens could think up. I set down the dish with a flourish. "Apple crisp," I said, "fresh from the oven." Amanda gave one of those smiles practiced for cameras and company, the kind that lifts only the mouth while the eyes stay flat. She took one plateful, twirled her fork as if she had nowhere else to be, and then, in a voice I still hear when I close my eyes, she said something that would change the room. First, it was a dismissal. "Do we really need another one of these?" And that would have stung on its own. But then it fed into something older, something I had been trying to ignore in the private corners of my days. She said it out loud, that the help I gave, my money over the years, wasn't love. It was a transaction. There was a tone there that suggested my time, my presence, my desserts meant little unless I contributed to the family's bottom line. "You're family when we need money," she told me. "You buy your way into our lives." The sentence landed like a verdict. I remember the way Jake, 16 now, went very still across from me. Emma, 14, fidgeted with the napkin at the end of the table, eyes wide but trying to look like she was reading something on her phone. Brian looked down at his plate and then up again, his face going slack in that particular way men make when they are trying to find a ground that isn't shifting. For a few seconds, he did not speak. I felt heat climb my neck and then cool away into a hollow place below my ribs. I have spent years learning how to shrink in a room when the waves come, how to protect the ones I love by making myself small. But that day, something steadied inside me. Maybe it was the look on my grandchildren's faces. Maybe it was the childish indignity of someone mocking my apple crisp. Or maybe it was simply the exhaustion of decades of being taken for granted in small, accumulating transactions that had added up to a life I had not planned to surrender. "Stop," I said. "Stop calling only when you want money." It was a quiet command. It was the first time I had said those words out loud in a way that made them stick. Amanda's expression changed. Her smile tightened and then dropped away. She scoffed, made a remark about control, about interference, about how help had come with strings. Her voice had that sharp edge that grows when someone knows they've got leverage. The room slotted into a brittle silence that sounded louder than any shouting. Brian tried to mediate, said something about family, about not making a scene in front of the children, and then sank back into an uneasy quiet as if waiting to see which way the wind would blow. I don't remember the precise sequence of each line. Memory in those scenes collects in splinters, snatches of warmth from the oven, the jangle of keys on the counter, the way a pine needle stuck to the sleeve of my cardigan. But I remember the effect of the moment. Humiliation, like someone had taken a photograph of me and pinned it to the wall for everyone to see. I remember thinking very clearly that for years I had been tolerating scraps for the sake of being included. The rest of the afternoon blurred. Couples' voices, the clatter of dishes, the grandchildren's half-laughed, half-awkward attempts at distraction. Amanda made a point of erasing my contribution. She told people that the apple crisp wasn't needed, that she'd already bought dessert. She laughed a certain way when I tried to edge in to offer another serving. It wasn't dramatic at first. Most cruelty isn't. It's a slow practice of omission and small dominations that add up. But that day, she moved from omission to explicitness in a way I couldn't let slide. There was a private moment in the kitchen later on. 2 women standing with dishcloths, the sink full of suds. Amanda pushed a plate into my hands and said, conversationally, that help had to come with rules. She told me, calmly, almost mechanically, what my role should be. Present, grateful, and quiet unless permission to speak was extended. She said, more plainly than she had at the table, that the money I had given Brian and the family was the reason I was tolerated. That's how it works, she said. For a minute, I felt like I could disappear into the suds. For a minute, I thought the world had simply decided that my dignity was exchangeable. When I left Brian's that night, I thought about what had been said and how easy it had all been for them to normalize. I thought about how kindness and money can get tangled until you can't tell one from the other. At home later, I sat at the little oak table in my kitchen, the one with the wobble in the left leg, and I took out an old spiral notebook. I have kept a record of the small loans and gifts I made over the years. I thought, at first, I'd just do a few entries to clear my head, maybe write down dates so I could remember numbers properly. What I hoped for, in a childish, private way, was some kind of mathematical explanation. Maybe if the numbers were small, I could talk to Brian and make him see it was all just a practical, mutual arrangement that had somehow been misread. The first page almost made me laugh with its simplicity. There were entries for $1,200 here, $3,000 there, help for a car, help for a deposit. I went through bank statements, old cashier's checks, shoved receipts under my reading lamp like forensic evidence from a life lived generously. When I added them up, the first total on the page was $43,000. I remember the air leaving my body. I had a dizzy flashback to all the small moments where a check slid across a table, a whispered thanks, Mom, a promise to pay me back that never quite materialized into anything but goodwill and temporary indicators. $43,000. $43,000 suddenly explained a lot of the fatigue I had been carrying. It explained the odd emptiness that sometimes sat on my chest, the way my savings were lower than I remembered, the surprise of looking at a Medicare statement and wondering why I had to pick and choose a medical procedure because I didn't feel like draining accounts I thought were safe. But that wasn't the end. I kept digging. There were other transfers, more recent ones I had almost forgotten because they had felt like one-off loans in a storm. I found transfers made to different accounts, small cash gifts tucked into envelopes at birthdays and difficult months. When I included those, gifts intended to help with a move, with tuition, with unexpected bills, the number climbed to $67,000. $67,000. I ran my fingers along the lip of my teacup until the porcelain grew warm. I had never imagined the total like that. The money was not the only offense. There was the insult, the cleaning out of my dignity in a kitchen that had always felt safe. But seeing the number line like a spine of paper revealed an architecture of dependence that had been built around the family for years, and I had not seen the builder's plan until then. With the bank statements open, I started to notice patterns. There were transfers that occurred right before big purchases appeared on social media. A white handbag and a photo with Amanda that I had seen and admired from a distance. Dinners out posted with a glossy caption. A new phone case and a selfie that seemed expensive. None of these things in themselves prove anything. They could be coincidences. But by then, I had stopped looking for the glow of benign explanations. I was looking for clarity. I began an online search, just a gentle one at first, typing Amanda's full name. A name, after all, is a road sign. It tells you where someone has been. What turned up in the search feed made my breath hitch. There was a single reference to a past legal matter, something that read like an old newspaper clipping, a sealed embezzlement case from years earlier, a small business owner involved in allegations that later vanished from public notice. The headline was vague. The file itself was not public, but the breadcrumb trail of that headline matched a time when Amanda had changed her last name, professional details were updated, and then, quietly, almost ghost-like, she reappeared with a different story. Online searches can be messy places for truth. Names get duplicated, coincidences conflate into conspiracy in the wrong hands. I tried to keep my breathing even. I wrote "sealed embezzlement case" in the margins of my notebook. I underlined it twice. I wrote down dates that matched the timeline of transfers I had made. The dates synchronized, not perfectly, but enough to make me feel like a gloved hand had been found clinging to something under a couch cushion. Not proof, but a clear lead. I tried to sleep that night and found I could not. Memories sifted through me like coins in a pocket. A thanks that sounded too sharp. A visit cut short because, as Amanda said once, "We've got to save for this. We can't be giving away money all the time." There were casual mentions of debt that seemed rehearsed, and always the shrug that disguised a kind of calculation. The next morning, I woke up determined to do something about it. Not revenge, not a spiral into anger that would eat my days. I needed to know. I needed evidence. I needed to understand whether these were mistakes and misunderstandings or part of a pattern that had been present for years and had finally tipped into abuse. I called Brian. He answered on the second ring, voice warm with sleep. He is my son, and even now when I think of him, I see the boy with the freckled bridge of his nose and grease under his fingernails from some car repair. He is practical and not a man of dramatic gestures. He loves his children in the small, manifest ways, booking piano lessons, showing up at games, arguing about bedtimes. But there is a softness in him, a desire to keep his family whole that can be manipulated by someone who knows how to play quiet games. "Mom," he said, "everything okay?" "Just numbers," I told him. "I want to talk when you have a minute." He was quiet for a beat that felt long. The tone changed. "Is it about Amanda?" I felt my heart drop. He was protective of her in all the ways you expect a son to be protective of his partner, perhaps more so because she was the one the grandchildren loved in certain ways he admired. She organized parties, curated their clothes, seemed to know exactly when to step in and when to step back. But there was a line in his voice, a hesitation that betrayed something else, and I realized he had seen the edge of whatever was waiting for us. "I've been keeping track," I said. I told him the total. I told him the numbers. $43,000 in direct transfers I had documented, rising to $67,000 when I included the additional assistance and gifts. I could feel the shape of the words like a net around my chest. Silence again. Then, finally, his voice small and vulnerable. "I had no idea, Mom." There it was, 2 words that either meant ignorance or shock. I tried not to let my disappointment tip into accusation. I had to hold the line. "No one is accusing anyone yet," I said. "I don't want drama, Brian. I want clarity. I want to understand." We made a tentative plan to meet at his house that evening to talk. He sounded uncertain, not because he didn't love me, but because he was about to be pulled in 2 directions, his mother and the woman he'd built a life with. The thing that kept tugging at me was this. When someone tells your mother she is tolerated only because of the money she sends, that's not a family dispute over boundaries. That's a position of transactional power being described in front of your children. And the children, Jake and Emma, were the ones I needed to protect. That afternoon, I went back through every statement, every check stub, every small bank transfer. I printed a tidy list. I annotated it with dates, with context, car repair, deposit, gift, birthday. I wrote down places where a transfer preceded a big purchase posted on social media, places where Amanda's online activity hinted at a lifestyle that didn't quite align with the modest face she showed Brian's mother. There was a strange double life in those pages. My domestic life, holiday dinners, knitting groups, a book club that met in coffee shops, and a financial ledger that quietly told another story. I felt exposed in a way I had not previously allowed myself. How many times had I dismissed the little flush of shame when a promise to repay did not appear? How many times had I told myself that love was more important than money, and then watched the ledger of my own life tip toward a deficit? That evening at Brian's, the house felt fragile. I sat at the kitchen counter and watched Amanda move around with a breezy efficiency that now struck me as performative rather than effortless. She had a way of folding herself into the center of things and then shaping the perimeter so no one questioned her. It was the kind of social mastery that can convince people they are seeing only what the master allows. There was a strange double life in those pages. My domestic life, holiday dinners, knitting groups, a book club that met in coffee shops, and a financial ledger that quietly told another story. I felt exposed in a way I had not previously allowed myself. How many times had I dismissed the little flush of shame when a promise to repay did not appear? How many times had I told myself that love was more important than money, and then watched the ledger of my own life tip toward a deficit? That evening at Brian's, the house felt fragile. I sat at the kitchen counter and watched Amanda move around with a breezy efficiency that now struck me as performative rather than effortless. She had a way of folding herself into the center of things and then shaping the perimeter so no one questioned her. It was the kind of social mastery that can convince people they are seeing only what the master allows. When Brian and I finally spoke, he was apologetic and confused, caught between loyalty and the slow burn of recognizing something he had missed. He asked questions and listened more than he spoke. There was a pain in his face. He had been used before, in smaller ways, in the kind of human ways that leave you both embarrassed and heartbroken. He wanted to believe the best. "We'll talk to her," he said. "We'll sort this out. I don't want to make this into something it's not." I could hear him trying to protect both sides, protect the family and protect me. I understood. I also understood that protection could sometimes be an anesthetic. The conversation did not resolve much. Amanda stayed practiced and polite in the background, and at the end of the evening, she gave me a forced hug that felt like a gesture in a play. I left feeling both vindicated and galled, like someone whose coat had been turned inside out in public. A few days later, things took a turn that I had not expected. I received a phone call from a local officer, Patricia Wells, who had come out to the house after someone reported that Amanda alleged I had threatened her. The official visit felt surreal, like a thin film between me and the ordinary world. I had been at Brian's, I had left, and suddenly there was police paperwork to be filed because the person who had said I was tolerated had now said I had been violent. Officer Wells was kind and professional. She listened to my account without indignation and told me her role was to take notes and to ensure everyone's safety. She explained that Amanda had called and said she felt threatened. I told Officer Wells what had actually happened: the insult at the table, the push and pull, the money conversations, the ledger I'd been keeping. I was careful with my words. I was measured. I did not want to become the person who turned everything into a battle. I also wanted the record to show the truth of what had been said. The presence of law enforcement on the doorstep made everything feel sharper, more serious. It was as if the thin mist behind which the family had operated, polite silences, little humiliations, small financial exchanges, had been lifted just enough for daylight to enter. Officer Wells filed a report and left me with her card. She said she would put the details into the system. She did not make promises about outcomes. She offered, quietly, to follow up if I wanted to give additional information. I did want to give additional information. That night, I went back to my spreadsheet and to the online search results that had given me the breadcrumbs of a sealed case. The sealed case itself was not public. That part was indefinito. Sealed files mean the public record is incomplete or undisclosed. But the reference, the breadcrumb, matched a timeline where Amanda's history had odd gaps and sudden changes. Names adjusted, addresses altered, a pattern of rebranding that made me uncomfortable. I won't pretend I was not afraid. The idea that I, small, older, practical, would be targeted for financial advantage by someone close to me hurt in an ancestral way. You don't expect to become a figure in someone else's ledger. You expect to be a person with a name, with strengths and vulnerabilities that deserve mutual respect. When those lines blur into transaction sentences, the world tilts. Still, fear sharpened into resolve. I had a record now. I had numbers. I had the memory of the insult. I had Officer Wells' note in a police log. What I did not have yet was the certainty to put a puzzle together and show it to someone else who could take action beyond listening. That decision hovered like a temperature at the edge of the room. I made tea. I wrote a list of what I needed: clearer documentation of transfers, any receipts or digital traces of purchases, names tied to accounts if I could find them, and more corroboration about the sealed case. It felt like assembling the pieces of a puzzle I had lived inside for years without realizing the picture was anything but benign. I reached for the phone again, thinking of who to call next. An attorney? A family mediator? The idea of a conversation with other authorities felt heavy, but I felt lighter for finally naming what had been nameless for a long time. This wasn't just the usual holiday tension. This felt like exploitation disguised as domestic life. It felt like a clever, slow siphoning. I did what many of us do when we suspect something bigger than ourselves. I started to watch. Not in a paranoid, invasive way, but with the careful attention of someone checking a plant for signs of disease. When did payments occur? What did she post afterward? Which accounts appeared and then vanished? I noted a few more transfers that aligned suspiciously with purchases, and a pattern developed like a map. Money, lifestyle posts, sudden appearances of items that had not previously fit the family's established budget. There was a small, sickening clarity to it. The ledger was a language. It spoke of dependence, of negotiations dressed up as help, and of a quiet erosion of my security and dignity. I sat with that clarity for a long time, letting it settle into my bones. It did not feel like vindication exactly. It felt like a turning point. Until that moment, I had tolerated small humiliations in the name of being a good mother, a good grandmother, a peacemaker. I had let my own comfort be flattened in order to preserve a sense of family. But clarity is a dangerous thing. Once it arrives, you cannot unknow it. And when my grandchildren were involved, I could no longer accept the cost of my silence. When the phone rang the next morning, I almost didn't answer. I had a list printed and a plan in the rough sketch of my head. I felt like I was holding a fragile glass in the palm of my hands. Evidence, pride, fear, love. My life had been rearranged into something that required action, and I was the one who had to start. The voice on the line belonged to a woman who said she was with the Financial Crimes Unit Detective Sarah Reeves. She told me she had seen a report flag in their system, something that came up after Officer Wells's visit, and that she wanted to talk. She asked me to come in, to bring my notes, and to explain in my own words what had occurred and what I had found. For a long moment, I listened to the beep of her voice in my ear and felt as if I had been moved forward on someone else's chessboard. This was not about shame anymore. This was about facts and protection. I drove to the station with my notebook in my bag, the pages weighted and trembling like old leaves. I did not know then how far we would go or whether the paperwork of my grief could become the architecture of justice. But I knew I had taken the first step of refusing to be small when it mattered most. Detective Reeves met me at a nondescript conference room on the second floor, the kind of room that feels both important and oddly ordinary. A rectangular table, a pot of stale coffee in the corner, a bulletin board with a handful of pinned memos. She had the calm, focused air of someone used to assembling fragments into patterns. Her badge sat on a leather strap. Her voice was steady. She asked me to start at the beginning, and I told her the story exactly the way it had happened. Apple Crisp, the kitchen, the words, the ledger, the totals, $43,000, and then $67,000 when I included the other transfers. She listened without blinking. When I finished, she folded her hands and explained, in plain language, what the Financial Crimes Unit did and what it did not. She said they did not take every ledger and pursue it like a crusade. They looked for patterns, for accounts, for traces that connected money to people and practices that suggested systematic exploitation. She did not promise outcomes. She asked me to share everything, my bank statements, my checkbook, any notes on when transfers were made, and the social posts that seemed to follow certain transactions. She wanted anything that tied a payment to a date and anything that tied a date to a purchase. "You did the right thing coming in," she said quietly. "We'll look at the financial paper trail and see what it shows. We may have questions you don't expect, and there may be things we can't disclose. Will you be available to talk if we need more?" I told her I would be. I felt both fragile and clumsy with the new role she was offering me, the role of a witness, of someone whose memory and paperwork might help others find a truth they could no longer ignore. Detective Reeves told me the ledger and my notes would be entered into evidence. She said they would try to corroborate purchases and account names, and that sometimes these investigations involved a sting or controlled operation to confirm whether funds were being moved to accounts not tied to the people who claimed them. The word sting felt dramatic in that room, like something that belonged in police procedurals and not the neighborhood where my son had grown up. She explained it as she would to a neighbor at a coffee shop, a controlled, recorded meeting designed to give someone the chance to reveal information voluntarily, bank account numbers, routing information, admissions, while detectives listened and documented. I asked about the risks. She was candid. Nothing was guaranteed. Things could go wrong, and the family might face tension. She said they would only proceed with careful planning and legal oversight. For the next several days, my life narrowed into a corridor of two things: waiting and watching. Detective Reeves called periodically, updates that were measured and clinical. "We'd like to see if Amanda will talk about accounts. We have a plan to see if she will disclose banking information. This may involve an arranged conversation." She asked me to continue to record anything of note and to document posts or purchases that coincided with transfers. Meanwhile, at home, I kept doing the ordinary things that had always steadied me: washing the same mugs, knitting the same square for a charity blanket, watering the geraniums on my windowsill. But the background hum of that ordinary life felt different now. It was not the comfortable buzz of routine. It was the low-level noise of someone waiting to be called to testify. I found myself practicing the small steadinesses, sleeping with the blinds slightly ajar, keeping a list of what I would say if I were called to a meeting again, rehearsing the numbers so I would not stumble. A week in, Detective Reeves asked if I would participate in a controlled meeting. The plan, she told me, had to be delicately staged. They proposed that I offer what would appear to Amanda as a large, unexpected inheritance. an arranged envelope that Amanda would learn about and target. The amount was not real, it was a ruse. The detectives wanted to present the opportunity and see whether Amanda would disclose account numbers or take steps revealing the pattern they suspected. They would record the conversation. If Amanda took steps to move or explain how she would access those funds and reveal accounts or other details, they'd have grounds to act. I felt a jolt of conflicting emotions. Part of me recoiled. This felt like entrapment, something theatrical and mean. Another part understood that sometimes suspect behavior needs to be drawn out with controlled light, and that the choice to speak is telling. Detective Reeves assured me that the operation would be lawful and supervised. They had to protect everyone, including me and the children. She promised protocols to keep the grandchildren away from exposure and to ensure the arrest, if any, would be executed in a way that minimized drama around them. I agreed, not because I wanted to be dramatic, but because I had reached a point where clarity mattered more than comfort. I did not want Amanda to get away with humiliating me in front of my grandchildren and to continue a pattern that could harm others. I also needed to be sure I wasn't misreading things, to be confident that I had not mistaken normal family dynamics for exploitation. The possibility of being wrong made my hands tremble, but the alternative, letting a pattern continue unexamined, felt worse. Detective Reeves explained the role I would play. I would be the one to arrange an informal meeting, make a passing comment about a sudden inheritance or a legacy left in a will, and see how Amanda reacted. They would have plainclothes officers nearby and recording devices in place. She asked me not to tell Brian or the kids about the setup. That was a painful ask. I had to balance honesty and the risk of compromising an operation. She promised that if the operation moved forward, they would move quickly and then communicate with Brian in a way that would not jeopardize evidence or safety. The day of the meeting arrived with a strange light. It was late winter, but the bulbs along the street outside my small apartment blinked with condensation. The city had the soft gray clarity that makes faces look like pencil sketches. Detective Reeves met me at a cafe halfway between our houses to go over last-minute details. She reminded me of my lines, not scripted, but a conversational hook. I just found out something about an old relative's estate. I might be getting a fair bit of money unexpectedly. She told me to be natural, to use the inheritance as a hypothetical to allow Amanda to speak. She told me to keep the conversation to a neutral, casual tone, to avoid leading her with specifics about amounts or bank accounts. I felt like an actress with a very high-stakes role. Amanda agreed to meet for coffee. She did this kind of social thing the way some people breathe, effortless, practiced, with a practiced charm that put people at ease. She arrived in a sleek coat with a scarf, early, exactly on cue. For a single breath, I felt the old, softer shape of her, the one who baked cupcakes at school fundraisers, the one who consoled neighbors in small crises. Then we began to talk. I opened with a tentative comment. I just found out there might be some money tied up in an estate, maybe something unexpected. It's all a bit unclear. Amanda's smile changed. It went sharp, then eager, the way a person scans a menu and finds a dish they like. She leaned in, her voice low and interested. Really? How much? I kept the figure vague as Detective Reeves instructed. It could be substantial, I said. I mean, substantial enough to make some changes if it comes through. The detective's recorder was discreet, a little black dot under the table, and they had a plainclothes officer approximately 2 tables away. I spoke casually, letting the idea breathe. Amanda's eyes flicked to the edges. She seemed to weigh possibilities in the set of her jaw. "If you needed help moving it," she said, almost before I could imagine the sentence finished, "we could get that sorted. I know the quickest ways to move money. You'd want it in an account that's accessible, and I can make arrangements." Her tone was businesslike, and a cold thing settled in my throat. The detective's eyes were steady through the window of their observation point. Detective Reeves had allowed her to speak first to gauge whether she would mention accounts, routing numbers, or transfer methods. "How would you manage it?" I asked, soft as instructed. Amanda named a bank. She mentioned a method, an informal wire, an account under a different name, and then, as if she were reminding herself about how simple it would be, she pulled out her phone. She began to type numbers into the Notes app as she spoke, as casually as someone writing a grocery list. She gave an account number. She gave an alternate phone and the name of someone she said could facilitate a quick transfer. I felt a tug. My heart began to pound in my ears. On the table, I kept my face neutral. Detective Reeves's voice did not break. She had already signaled the officers. When Amanda finished giving the account details, she smiled as if she were offering help. "We can have that taken care of in a day," she said. "You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." There is a peculiar clarity that comes in moments like that. It's as if everything slows and rearranges. Words take on the quality of objects in a still life. I remember the scrape of a spoon, the way sunlight caught a coffee ring on the tabletop, the low murmur of other conversations. I remember counting the digits she had typed into her phone, how they matched a pattern that I had seen in transfers on my statements. The plainclothes officers moved in with quiet efficiency. I felt a hand on my shoulder, a soft squeeze that read like a warning and a reassurance at once. Detective Reeves rose, introduced herself, and said the overhead words that felt like thunder to my ears. "Amanda, you are under arrest." There was no screaming, no cinematic chase. Amanda's face, for the first time since that Christmas, went open and stunned. She flailed with questions. "What? No, this isn't." And then a kind of admittance slid through her features that was more a calculation than a confession, the realization that a planned path had been disrupted and that the options she had been considering were not available anymore. The officers read her rights, handcuffed her, and led her away. I do not remember every exchange exactly. Memory, again, fragments and tiles into a mosaic, pieces of sound, flashes of motion. I remember the officer who led her past me, whose eyes did not look scornful, but professional. I remember the quiet in my chest, a tightness that felt like something closing, and then a slow release like the loosening of a knot. Afterwards, there were procedural things. I gave a statement that matched what was on the recording. Detective Reeves reviewed parts of the audio with me to be sure we had captured everything clearly. I listened to Amanda's voice on playback, the business-like cadences of someone describing how to handle money. It was small and terrifying, like the sound of a machine working behind a domestic wall. Detective Reeves told me they had found accounts Amanda mentioned. They were connected to names that were not immediately public, but linked through documents the detectives had been piecing together. She explained that investigations like this have many steps: paperwork to file, interviews to conduct, audits to run, and then, if appropriate, arrests to formalize things and prevent further transfers. She again cautioned me about outcomes. Arrested does not mean guilty, she said. It means there is probable cause to take someone before a court. Everything beyond arrest is handled by prosecutors and the courts. When I called Brian that night, he was quiet at first, then angry, then disbelieving. He wanted facts, and I gave him what I could without jeopardizing the case or the detective's work. He came to the station with his hands in his pockets and his face pale. The meeting we had there was not a dramatic scene of shouting. It was a family caught in the slow, heavy machinery of the legal process, muted and bureaucratic and strangely intimate. "I just don't understand how I didn't see it," he said. The words lodged somewhere between hurt and shame. His grief over the potential betrayal was not theatrical. It was like a small physical thing that settled on the chest. "You couldn't have seen everything, Brian," I said. "These things are quiet, incremental. They grow in the background where it feels safe. Look at the ledger. Look at the dates. We're not trying to punish. We're trying to understand and protect Jake and Emma. They're what matters." He nodded. He blamed himself, as sons often do when the home they built shows cracks. He asked how the kids were coping. I kept their names from the press because the detectives had asked for discretion to protect them during the investigation. Jake and Emma were with their father, unaware of the legal terms and focusing on schoolwork and the routines that punctuate a teenage day. They had been hurt and embarrassed at Christmas. They had watched their grandmother be made small. They are children, 16 and 14, and I wanted to keep them just that. Amanda's arrest was followed by other steps: interviews, searches that matched accounts, subpoenaed records, and closed-circuit displays of bank transfers. Detective Reeves and her team worked methodically, leaning on the documentation I had brought in and the recording from the cafe. There were moments in those weeks when I felt like a participant in a slow-motion bureaucratic waltz. Forms were filled, signatures obtained, and little boxes checked by people who spoke a language of procedure I was slowly learning. At times, I worried about the costs of all this: the social cost within the family, the weight on Brian's shoulders, the shock to the grandchildren. I feared gossip, whispers, the kind of community commentary that uses your private pain as its pastime. Yet each time I felt the fear rise, I reminded myself of what had happened the previous Christmas, the phrase, "your family when we need money," and I felt steadier. The stakes were not simply procedural. They were about the dignity of a 70-year-old woman being treated like a credit line. The case did not resolve overnight. It unfolded in fits and starts, as legal matters do. There were court dates set as indefinito for certain motions, some hearings open, others sealed. Detective Reeves kept me informed in the careful, measured way that protects the integrity of an investigation. She told me when evidence was transferred to prosecutors, when additional interviews were scheduled, when they had to be careful about what could be discussed publicly. She emphasized that the goal at this stage was to ensure no additional harm would be done and that assets would not be moved out of reach while the matter was examined. Through all of this, Brian's loyalties were strained. He wanted to stand by Amanda, wished to believe in the woman he had loved and built a life with. Yet here was a ledger and a recording and a set of procedural facts that could not be easily dismissed. He attended talks with the detectives and with me. He sat with the tensions in a way that was honest but not performative. There were arguments, of course, silent, tense dinners, the occasional sharpness in a private message. But the overriding feeling I had watching him was not malice. It was heartbreak over the possibility that the woman he had trusted had operated in ways he had not seen. Amanda, meanwhile, maintained her own posture in public, an appearance of composure and the kind of deflection that people construct when under pressure. I refused to recount her private phone calls or to fashion scenes of rage or collapse that the transcripts do not bear out. She was arrested. That is a recorded fact. What I cannot do and will not do is invent a performance for her in the weeks that followed. People respond differently under scrutiny, and the record is the record. The grandchildren, Jake and Emma, processed this in their own measured ways. Jake, at 16, had begun to understand more plainly what kitchen tables and ledgers could mean. Emma, 14, seemed to retreat into her schoolwork and the small kinds of solace teenagers find in friends and music. I spent extra time with them in the weeks after the arrest, quietly, not intrusively. We baked sometimes, we read comic strips in the Sunday paper, we sat side by side on the couch in companionable silence that needed no explanation. My priority was their well-being, to ensure that they experienced safety and continuity, not rumors and spectacle. One of the more painful parts of this process was the ripple effect in our extended family. Some people wanted to know details, some wanted to judge, some wanted to rally. I found that the people who reached out with the most compassion did not demand a narrative. They listened. They brought casseroles, they sat and knitted with me, or took my groceries in for a day. Those gestures meant more than any statement of blame could. In time, the public side of the case receded into the procedural machinery of justice. There were hearings, and Amanda's lawyers argued motions, and detectives provided testimony where required. I was called upon occasionally to clarify dates, to identify transfers, to recount the exchange at the table. Sitting in a witness chair is a humbling thing. I found myself speaking slowly and plainly, letting the numbers speak as much as my memory did. The recordings were played for the record, the ledger was entered as an exhibit. Throughout, Detective Reeves continued to act with a steadied patience. She did not offer grand pronouncements, she gave me updates and stayed within the boundaries of what she could disclose. Every time I wanted certainty, she returned the conversation to process. "We can neither promise nor predict," she would say. "We can only follow the evidence." What this whole episode taught me, in a daily, granular way, was how easy it is for affection and financial dependency to be braided together until a person who means well finds themselves in an arrangement that erodes their dignity. Gift-giving and assistance can be expressions of love. They can also be channels that, over time, create a quiet expectation that one person will always subsidize another's life. Not every request for help is exploitation. Not every saving of pennies is a warning. But patterns matter. The cadence of transfers, the accompanying demands or shaming rhetoric, the way gratitude is withheld and leverage is introduced, those are the things that build a structure that needs scrutiny. After the arrest, the first holiday that followed felt like a restart. Brian and I sat down at his kitchen table, not to argue, but to plan boundaries. We talked about the future and what I could give in ways that protected both my heart and my account balance. The conversation was practical. We discussed a monthly amount I could afford as a gift, rules about transparency in the use of those funds, and the necessity of maintaining my own savings for retirement and health care. I made it clear, gently but firmly, that the era of ad hoc rescue was over. The years of small sacrifices that added up to $67,000 had to be the last of their kind. "I don't want to hide from my family," I told him, "but I want respect. I want dignity. If I offer help, it should not be a currency that buys acceptance. It should be an act that is complied with, not a bribe for toleration." Brian listened and eventually said, "You shouldn't have had to choose between being loved and being safe, Mom." He sounded tired. It was one of those moments where family honesty surfaced like something clean and wet from the bottom of a riverbed. There were practical changes, too. I consolidated accounts, set up a simple budget with a local financial advisor whose name a friend recommended, and set up certain controls to prevent impulsive transfers. I told Detective Reeves about the advisor as part of my efforts to create a transparent paper trail for the future. I felt a small amount of empowerment in each of these steps, as if tidying the financial corners of my life was also tidying the emotional corners. The legal matter proceeded on its own terms after that. I was spared the worst of the publicity because the detectives and prosecutors handled sensitive information with the care one reserves for the vulnerable. I cannot speak to the ultimate legal outcomes in detail here because some parts remained undefined at the time I last spoke with the detectives. Sealed filings, pending motions, matters that were subject to legal confidentiality. What I can say with certainty is that an arrest was made, that it came after careful planning and evidence gathering, and that the operation was carried out with the explicit intention of protecting potential victims and establishing a factual record. The emotional arc for me moved from shock and hurt to a slow, steadier clarity. I learned that anger can be a useful tool when harnessed. It sharpened my focus during the investigation, made me insist on documentation, and kept me from shrinking back into old habits of tolerance and self-blame. But I also had to learn how to process that anger without letting it become the axis of my life. I took up small routines. I walked in the park at dusk. I joined a community choir. I began teaching a baking class at the community center for seniors, which brought me back to the simple joy of sharing apple crisp without expectation. Those moments reminded me that my life is not defined by what others take or say about me. One of the more surprising outcomes was how this experience changed the way I navigated relationships. I became more comfortable setting boundaries, and not in a harsh way, but in a way that said, my generosity is a gift, not a contractual obligation. When friends asked about money and help, I found phrases that respected both my feelings and their needs. I can help this much, I would say, and if you need more, let's plan it together. The simple exercise of saying those sentences aloud felt revolutionary at my age. Protecting Jake and Emma remained my North Star. After the immediate upheaval settled, I took steps to ensure that their contact with the family was anchored in routines rather than in the dramas of financial conflict. We established regular nights, pizza and a movie where gadgets were out of reach and conversation was allowed to drift. I tried to let them be teenagers first. The adult dramas could be handled by the adults. I also made sure they had someone to talk to outside the family if they needed. Counseling resources were offered quietly and without fanfare as a matter of normal care. Looking back, there are moments I wish I had recognized sooner. The small rhetorical jabs that indicated a pattern of leverage, the way help was framed with a title deed to my presence. Yet regret is a poor companion. What mattered more was that I did something when the clarity arrived. I took evidence to professionals. I documented what I could. I allowed law enforcement to follow the paper trail. And when the detectives moved, I permitted them to do their work, even though it meant the family would be tested. There's a temptation in stories like mine to transform them into parables of villainy and virtue, demonize and sanctify. Real life is messier. Brian is not a villain. He is a man caught between love and a ledger. Amanda, in the public record, is someone who was arrested during an investigation, words that carry legal weight but do not satisfy every personal question. The grandchildren are children recovering from a holiday where their small world showed a fault line. The detectives were professionals doing their jobs, and the community that rallied around me did what communities do. They offered casseroles and time. In the end, dignity matters more than being right. I could have pursued this as a crusade to shame. I chose a different path. I chose to ask for clarity, to document, to partner with people whose job it was to make sense of financial patterns. The difference between these choices was not moral superiority. It was practical. I wanted to protect my family and my grandchildren. I wanted to stop a pattern before it became the only pattern my life allowed. A few months after the arrest, I was at a small gathering where someone I hardly knew leaned over and said quietly, "I heard what happened. I'm sorry." I blinked and smiled, and she added, "I once gave more than I thought and later realized I had been part of a draining process. I didn't do anything, but your story, you handled it well." Well felt like a big word. I had been frightened and unsure more times than I can remember. I had been wrong and clumsy in small ways, but I had also kept a ledger. I had listened to my discomfort. I had partnered with professionals. Those were not heroic acts. They were practical ones. They were ways of taking care of the next chapter of my life. Now, when people ask me about the apple crisp, I laugh. It has become a symbol, a ridiculous pastry that carried the weight of an entire morning into a revelation. I still bring my dessert sometimes, but now I do it with rules. I bring one plate, which I expect to be appreciated without being employed as currency. I bring it because I like the ritual of making something for people I love, not because it buys me a seat at a table. If there's any advice I would pass on, not legal advice because I'm not qualified to give that, but life advice, it would be this. Keep clear records of financial help you give, particularly when it crosses into significant amounts. Listen to your instincts when something feels off. Documentation is not a betrayal. It's a way to preserve the truth of your generosity. And if you feel you are being made small in the name of family, Find someone to talk to who can help you see the pattern without the fog of love or shame. This experience changed me. I am not more bitter. I am more cautious and clear. I have new boundaries, a tidy ledger, and a deeper commitment to the people who will be in my life in the long run, my son and my grandchildren, people I will protect, not through silence, but through careful, steady action. I am still Margaret Maggie Foster. I'm still 67. I still bake apple crisp with a sprig of rosemary when the mood strikes, but I will never again let someone tell me that my presence is conditional on my bank balance. The Christmas that turned ugly taught me that dignity is not negotiable, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for the people you love is to refuse to be their ATM when it costs too much. If any part of my story resonates with you, if you've ever felt small in your own home or wondered whether generosity has become an obligation, please share your experience in the comments. There are many of us who learn the same lessons at different times, and community matters. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe for more true life accounts. There are others whose stories deserve to be heard. Thank you for listening to mine.